The thing about being buried alive is that it happens slowly, then all at once. One minute you're crawling through a limestone passage in eastern Utah, mapping caves for a summer research grant. The next minute the rock shifts, the air goes bad, and you're trapped 20 feet underground with your two best friends, wondering if anyone above ground even knows where to start looking for your bodies. You know how sometimes the worst decisions make the best stories? That's what I kept thinking about when I met Ashley Boone at a geology conference in Denver last year. She's in her 50s now, teaches hydrology at Colorado State, and still gets this distant look in her eyes when anyone mentions caving. She was the one who told me about Weller Draw, about that July morning in 1992 when 3 broke college students made a choice that almost killed them all. It's funny how memory works. Ask her about the technical details, and she'll rattle off limestone composition and airflow patterns like she's reading from a textbook. But ask her about what it felt like down there, and her hands start moving, sketching invisible walls in the air. The 3 of them have been mapping caves all summer for a research grant. Ashley, Tarek Hassan, and Dan Probst. 20-year-olds with more enthusiasm than sense, spending their days in the Utah backcountry with heavy packs and bigger egos. By July, they'd gotten cocky. They'd mapped a dozen small caves without incident and started taking shortcuts with safety protocols. You know the type, smart enough to know the rules, young enough to think they were exceptions. That morning started like any other. They'd checked in with the ranger station at 6:45 a.m., logged their general area as limestone shelf east of Weller Draw, and headed out. The first mistake, though none of them knew it yet. Dan's sister Rachel had been nagging him for weeks about filing more detailed plans, but Dan figured they were just doing routine survey work. What'd go wrong? Tarek spotted the sinkhole around noon. It was small, unremarkable except for some bleached animal bones scattered around the edges. Ashley wanted to investigate immediately. She had this thing about being first, about discovering something nobody else had found. Dan argued they should mark it and come back with backup, but Ashley was already anchoring rope to a nearby juniper tree. Peer pressure is a hell of a thing, especially when you're 20 and trying to prove yourself. The cave was beautiful. That's what Ashley remembers most. How pristine it was, how the limestone walls curved like something carved by hand instead of water. No graffiti, no beer cans, no footprints. Just them and thousands of years of geological patience. They named it Dead Juniper Cave after the gnarled tree above, and for the first hour, everything went perfectly. It's worth understanding something about these 3 personalities because it matters later. Ashley was the risk taker, always pushing to go deeper, see more, be first. Tarek was methodical, the one who kept track of their route with survey markers and chalk arrows, but he trusted Ashley's instincts. Dan was cautious by nature, but he was also 20 years old and desperately wanted to belong. Classic follower syndrome. He'd voice concerns, but always went along anyway. They pushed deeper through narrow passages, rappelling down small drops, squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. The cave became a maze, passages forking and twisting in directions that didn't make geological sense. Dan kept checking his watch, suggesting they head back, but Ashley insisted they map just one more chamber, one more passage. That's when the air changed. If you've never been caving, you might not understand what I mean by airflow. In any healthy cave system, you feel a breeze, subtle pressure changes that tell you there's circulation, other exits, connection to the surface. But suddenly, the air felt dead. Heavy. Wrong. The collapse happened quietly. Not a dramatic cave-in like you see in movies, but a muffled, settling sound, followed by the whisper of dust. When they tried to backtrack, they found their exit route blocked by a pile of loose rock and clay that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. Here's where the personalities really mattered. Ashley immediately started looking for alternative routes, refusing to acknowledge they might be trapped. Tarek began systematic problem solving, checking their equipment and mapping their current position. Dan panicked. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in that quiet way where your mind starts racing through worst-case scenarios. The bad air hit within 30 minutes. Carbon dioxide buildup, probably from decomposing organic matter in sealed chambers below them. Ashley's headache came first, then Tarek started coughing. Dan dropped his flashlight and couldn't remember why he'd been holding it. Tarek recognized the symptoms from his wilderness first aid training. They had to move or they'd suffocate. The only open passage led downward through a narrow squeeze, barely wide enough for Dan's shoulders. Ashley went first. She always went first. Tarek followed. Dan hesitated, knowing once he committed to that passage, there might not be room to turn around. He went anyway. What choice did he have? The tunnel narrowed progressively. Not dramatically, just inch by inch until Dan realized his shoulders were scraping both walls. He called ahead, told the others he was stuck, tried to push forward. That's when they felt the passage shift, a subtle settling that made the tight space even tighter. Sagging, cavers call it. Limestone under pressure can compress like putty, especially when moisture is involved. The tunnel that had been barely passable was now impassable. Dan was wedged tight, unable to move forward or backward, with his friends trapped ahead of him. Above ground, nobody knew where they were. The ranger station had their general area, but Weller Draw covers maybe 30 square miles of broken country. They could have been anywhere. What saved them was Rachel Probe's persistence. Dan's older sister had been worried about his caving all summer, especially after a close call in May where they'd gotten lost for 6 hours. She'd made Dan promise to give her detailed route plans, but like most 20-year-olds, he'd been vague about compliance. Still, she had a rough map of their study areas, and more importantly, she had the direct number for Uinta County Search and Rescue. At 9:14 p.m., when they still weren't back, Rachel made the call that saved their lives. The SAR response was textbook professional. For teams deployed with ground-penetrating radar and night vision equipment, they found a sinkhole at 2:07 a.m. by following GPS coordinates and looking for signs of recent activity. Rope marks on a juniper tree, disturbed soil around the entrance. The real challenge was getting them out alive. The original entrance was partially collapsed and potentially unstable. The students had been underground for almost 20 hours, breathing increasingly toxic air. Even if they could reach them, extracting Dan from that narrow passage might require breaking his ribs. Dr. Leo Kim from the Western Cave Conservancy arrived with ground mapping sonar equipment around 4 a.m. I've met Leo. He's one of those quietly competent people who shows up in emergencies and just starts solving problems. His team mapped the cave system from the surface and found what they were looking for, a side passage that connected to the main chamber, accessible through another sinkhole 200 yards upslope. The new entrance had to be widened with hand tools, carefully, because power equipment might trigger another collapse. Every hour mattered. Dan was semi-conscious from shallow breathing, and Ashley was vomiting from CO2 poisoning. SAR volunteers Brett Fisher and Winnie Hahn finally reached them at 7:13 a.m. Fisher crawled into the narrow passage where Dan was trapped and spent nearly an hour chipping away rock with a hammer and chisel, millimeter by millimeter, until they could shift Dan backward without breaking bones. At 8:02 a.m., after 25 hours underground, all 3 students were pulled to the surface. Alive, but barely. The aftermath tells you everything about how trauma affects people differently. Ashley developed a lung infection from inhaling cave dust and mold, but she was back underground within 6 months. She finished her geology degree, specialized in cave hydrology, and still consults on cave rescue techniques. The experience made her more careful, but didn't diminish her love for what she calls the underground world. Tarek went to medical school and became an emergency physician specializing in wilderness medicine. He credits that night with showing him what he wanted to do with his life: help people in situations where traditional medicine isn't enough. Dan left geology entirely. He works in software engineering now, lives in suburban Phoenix, hasn't been in a cave since 1992. When I tracked him down for this story, he was polite but firm about not wanting to discuss details. He did say the experience taught him the difference between calculated risks and stupid chances, though he admits he still sometimes dreams about being wedged in that passage, unable to breathe. The cave, officially named Boone's Hold now, was sealed with a steel grate and added to the National Cave Registry. Access requires permits and confined space certification. Every July, Uintah County SAR runs a training exercise based on that rescue. Not for tourists or casual cavers. For the professionals who go into places where one mistake can change everything and one good decision can bring everyone home. I asked Ashley if she had any regrets about that day. She thought for a long time before answering. No regrets about going into the cave. She said, that's who she was, who she still is. But she wished she'd listened to Dan about filing detailed route plans. She wished they'd brought backup air monitoring equipment. She wished they'd established check-in times with surface support. Mostly, she wished more young cavers understood that caves don't care about your experience level, your confidence, or your timeline. They've been there for millions of years, and they'll be there long after you're gone. Respect that, she says, and you might live long enough to appreciate what they have to teach you.